There are moments in life when reality presents you with something so subtle, so seemingly insignificant, that you almost dismiss it entirely. A glitch on a screen, a name repeated where it shouldn't be, a coordinate that exists twice. Most people would scroll past it, refresh the page, assume it was an error in the database. But what if it wasn't an error? What if it was an invitation? Or worse, what if it was evidence of something observing us so closely that it had learned to replicate not just our structures, but our systems, our behaviours, our routines? What you're about to hear is the account of someone who found a town that existed in two places at once. Not as a mistake, not as a twin city with a shared name, but as two identical locations occupying the same coordinates, separated by only a few miles, and something far more unsettling. This is the story of the town that appeared twice, the map that shouldn't exist. It started the way most strange journeys do, with boredom and a half-formed plan. I had 3 weeks off work, a reliable vehicle, and a growing restlessness that comes from spending too much time indoors. I had been thinking about taking a road trip through the southwest, one of those long wandering routes through desert highways and forgotten towns where you could drive for an hour without seeing another car. The kind of trip where you stop at diners with peeling paint and gas stations that still have analog pumps. I spent an entire evening mapping out potential routes. I used satellite view, zooming in on small towns I had never heard of, checking for places that looked interesting, old motels, scenic overlooks, places with strange names that suggested history or mystery or both. That's when I saw it. I had been scrolling through a stretch of highway in a remote part of Nevada, near the Utah border. The area was sparse, a few scattered towns, long stretches of empty desert, and not much else. I zoomed in on a small cluster of buildings labelled Mercer Springs. Population just under 2,000. A main street, a school, a few churches, standard layout for a rural American town. I bookmarked it and kept scrolling. 10 minutes later, I saw the name again. Mercer Springs. Same name, same layout, same street grid. But the coordinates were different. Not by much, maybe 3 miles northwest of the first location. At first I thought it was a duplicate listing, a bug in the mapping software. I clicked on the second marker and examined it closely. The satellite image loaded. It showed a town, streets, buildings, vehicles parked along a main street. It looked identical to the first location. I opened a second tab and compared them side by side. Same streets, same intersections, same building placements. Even the positioning of trees and parking lots seemed identical, but they were not the same image. The lighting was slightly different. The shadows fell at different angles, and when I zoomed in closely, I could see small variations. A blue truck parked in one image was absent in the other. A storefront painted green in one photo appeared tan in the second. I checked the metadata. Both listings showed the same town name. Both had the same zip code. Both referenced the same county records. I switched to Street View. The first location had full coverage. The second did not. The camera vehicle had apparently driven through the area, but the images were incomplete, stopping abruptly at the town's outskirts. I spent the next hour searching for information. I found a county website that listed Mercer Springs as an incorporated town. Population 2,100. Founded in 1923. Primary industries, agriculture and tourism. But there was no mention of a second location. No twin town, no sister city, no explanation. I checked forums, local history blogs, census records, nothing. The second Mercer Springs did not officially exist, but it was there on the map. Visible, documented, real. I made notes, I saved screenshots, I compared every detail I could find. The more I looked, the stranger it became. Not just the existence of two identical towns, but the way they were documented. The first town had a complete digital footprint, reviews on travel sites, social media posts from residents, local news articles about school board meetings and county fairs. The second town had almost nothing. A few scattered mentions in old surveying documents, a reference in a geological survey from the 1960s, but nothing recent, nothing that suggested people actually lived there. Yet the satellite images clearly showed a functioning town. I could see cars, I could see what appeared to be laundry hanging on lines behind houses. I could see the shadow of a person walking down one of the side streets. I decided I would visit both. I would document everything, take photos, talk to residents, and find out what was happening in Mercer Springs, or rather, in both of them. Chapter 1. The first visit. I arrived in Mercer Springs on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. The drive had taken most of the day, long stretches of highway bordered by red rock and sagebrush. The kind of landscape that makes you feel small and reminds you how much empty space still exists in this country. The town appeared exactly as it had on the satellite images. A single main street lined with brick buildings, a diner, a hardware store, a post office with an American flag hanging limply in the still air. Everything looked clean and functional, but not new. It had the worn-in quality of a place that had been the same for decades. I parked in front of the diner and stepped out. The air was dry and warm. The only sound was the faint hum of a generator somewhere behind one of the buildings. The silence was almost complete. No traffic noise, no music from open windows, just the occasional scrape of a boot on concrete or the distant bark of a dog. Inside the diner, I ordered coffee and a sandwich. The waitress was friendly, but not chatty. She moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done the same routine 1,000 times. I asked her how long she had lived in town. "All my life," she said. "Born here, probably die here." I smiled. "Must be a nice place to grow up." "Quiet," she said. "Not much happens, but that's how people like it." I asked if there were any other towns nearby. She listed a few, none of which matched the second Mercer Springs. I asked if there was another part of town, maybe a newer development or an outlying area. She looked at me strangely. "No, just this." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just curious. I saw something on a map." She nodded slowly and walked away. I watched her move behind the counter, refilling coffee cups and clearing plates. Her movements were fluid and natural. Nothing about her seemed unusual or off. I finished my meal and walked down the main street. Everything felt normal. People nodded as they passed. A man washed the windows of his storefront. A dog lay in the shade of a bench. It was the kind of town that felt like it had been frozen in time, but not unnaturally so, just preserved by routine and lack of disruption. I took photos. I noted street names. I walked the perimeter of the downtown area and confirmed that the layout matched the satellite images exactly. First Street, Second Street, Main Street, all arranged in a simple grid pattern. The post office sat on the corner of Main and Third. The hardware store was directly across the street. The school was 3 blocks east, a low brick building with a playground surrounded by chain-link fencing. I walked past the school and watched children playing during what must have been recess. They ran and shouted and chased each other across the blacktop. Teachers stood nearby, watching with the bored attention of people who had seen the same scene play out hundreds of times before. Everything was normal. Everything was mundane. There was nothing unusual, nothing that suggested anything strange. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, not by people, by the town itself, as though the buildings had eyes, as though the streets were recording my presence. I returned to my car and sat for a while, watching the flow of people and vehicles. A postal truck made its rounds. A woman pushed a stroller down the sidewalk. An elderly man sat on a bench outside the hardware store, reading a newspaper. I tried to identify anything that felt wrong, anything that didn't fit, but there was nothing. Mercer Springs was exactly what it appeared to be, a small, quiet town in the middle of nowhere, going about its daily business, without concern for the outside world. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the residential streets. The houses were modest but well maintained. Most had small yards, many had gardens. I saw American flags. I saw welcome mats. I saw bicycles leaning against garage doors and cars parked in driveways. I spoke to a few residents, an older woman watering her lawn, a man working on his truck, a teenager walking a dog. Everyone was polite. Everyone answered my questions. No one seemed suspicious or evasive. By evening, I had covered most of the town. I had taken dozens of photos. I had documented street names and building locations. I had collected business cards from local shops, and I'd found nothing unusual, but that was about to change. Chapter 2. The duplicate entry. The next morning I drove toward the second location. I had marked it on my GPS the night before. According to the coordinates, it was 3 miles northwest of the first town. The route took me along a county road that ran parallel to the highway, then turned onto a narrower road that seemed older, less maintained. The GPS recalculated 3 times in the first mile. Each time, it adjusted the route slightly, adding turns that didn't seem necessary. I ignored it and kept driving based on the coordinates I had written down. The road surface changed. Asphalt gave way to gravel, then to packed dirt. The landscape looked the same, dry earth and scattered brush, but something felt different. The air seemed heavier. The light was flatter, as though the sun were filtered through something I couldn't see. My phone signal weakened, then disappeared entirely. I kept driving. The road was rough. My car bounced over ruts and washboard sections. Dust rose in clouds behind me. I began to wonder if I had made a mistake, if the second location on the map had been an error after all, and I was simply driving into empty desert. But then the road curved, and I saw structures in the distance, buildings, a water tower, the outline of a town. After 20 minutes, the road curved sharply to the left, and I saw it clearly. Mercer Springs. Same layout, same buildings, same main street, but it was not the same town. Chapter 3. The second town. I parked in the same spot I had used the day before, in front of the diner. The building looked identical. Same brick facade, same sign, same layout of windows and doors, but the paint was a different shade. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Where the first diner had been a deep red, this one was more of a rust colour. The sign was the same design, but the font was slightly thicker. The letters seemed more compressed, as though someone had tried to recreate the original from memory. I stepped out of the car. The air felt different here, cooler, denser. The hum of the generator I had heard before was absent. Instead, there was a faint, rhythmic vibration, like the idle of a distant engine. It wasn't loud, it was barely perceptible, but once I noticed it, I couldn't ignore it. I walked toward the diner. The door was identical down to the placement of the handle, but when I opened it, the hinges made no sound. The door swung open smoothly, silently, as though it had been oiled recently. Inside, the layout was the same counter, same booths, same positioning of tables, but the colours were off. The vinyl on the seats was a shade darker. The floor tiles were arranged in a slightly different pattern. Where the first diner had checkerboard tiles, this one had them offset by half a square. A waitress approached. She looked like the woman I had spoken to the day before. Same height, same build, same hairstyle, but her face was different. Not dramatically, just enough that I couldn't say it was the same person. Her eyes were a slightly different colour. Her cheekbones were a fraction higher. It was like looking at a painting that had been copied by a talented but imperfect artist. "Coffee?" she asked. I nodded. "Please." She poured it without another word and walked away. Her movements were smooth but mechanical, as though she were following a script. She didn't ask how I wanted my coffee. She didn't make small talk. She just poured and left. I looked around. There were other people in the diner, a man reading a newspaper, a couple sitting in a booth near the window, an older man at the counter eating pie. They all looked familiar, not in the way you recognise someone you've met, but in the way you recognise a pattern. They resembled people I had seen in the first town. Similar faces, similar builds, but not identical. The man with the newspaper held it at exactly the same angle as a man I had photographed the day before. The couple in the booth sat in the same positions, their hands folded on the table in the same way. The older man ate his pie with the same methodical motions. It was as though someone had recreated the scene from the first diner, but had used slightly different actors. I drank my coffee and left money on the counter. The waitress nodded but said nothing. Her expression was neutral. Not cold, but empty. Outside, I walked down the main street. Every building matched the layout I'd memorised from the first town. The hardware store, the post office, the small bank with barred windows. But the details were wrong. A green awning where there had been a blue one. A window display showing different items. A truck parked at an angle that didn't match the flow of traffic. The street itself felt off. The pavement was the same material, but the cracks were in different places. A fire hydrant stood on the corner, painted red, but the paint was fresher, shinier, as though it had been applied recently. And the people, they moved normally, but their actions felt delayed. A man raised his hand to wave, but the gesture came a fraction of a second after I made eye contact. A woman turned to look at me, but her head moved, as though tracking me through water. I stopped in front of the post office and looked up at the sky. It was the same pale blue as the day before, but the sun seemed dimmer. The shadows it cast were slightly longer than they should have been for the time of day. I took out my notebook and began writing observations. I documented every difference I could see, the paint colours, the positioning of objects, the subtle variations in the faces of residents. I sketched the layout of the street and marked where things didn't match. The more I observed, the more convinced I became that this was not a coincidence. This was not a case of two towns that happened to have similar designs. This was deliberate. This was replication. But for what purpose? Chapter 4. The people. I decided to test something. I walked into the hardware store. Inside, a man stood behind the counter. He was arranging tools on a pegboard. He looked up as I entered. "Help you?" he asked. "Just browsing," I said. He nodded and returned to his work. I walked slowly through the aisles, noting the products. Hammers, screwdrivers, boxes of nails, everything you would expect in a small-town hardware store. But the brands were wrong. Not unfamiliar, but slightly altered. A hammer labelled Craftsman in a font that didn't quite match the company's branding. A box of screws with a logo I didn't recognise. I picked up a package and examined it. The text on the back was correct. Instructions, specifications, warnings, but the phrasing was awkward, as though translated poorly. Insert screw into surface material until flush with outer plane. That's not how the instructions would normally read. It would say something like, drive screw until flush with surface. I brought it to the counter. Is this a local brand? The man looked at the package. He paused for a long moment before answering. His eyes didn't move. He just stared at the package as though processing the question. Standard stock, he said finally. Where do you order from? Another pause, longer this time. I counted the seconds. Nearly 10 passed before he responded. Distributor, he said. His tone was flat, not rude, not evasive, just empty, as though he were reading from a script he didn't fully understand. I set the package down. Thanks, he nodded. His eyes followed me as I left, but his head didn't move. He tracked me with his gaze alone, his body remaining perfectly still behind the counter. I repeated this process in other buildings, the post office, the diner again, a small library on a side street. Every interaction felt the same. Questions were answered, but with delays. Responses were accurate, but generic. People looked at me, but their gazes felt observational rather than engaged. At the library, I found a woman shelving books. She looked like the woman who had been sweeping the sidewalk in the first town. Same general appearance, same age range, but her face was slightly different. Her movements slightly more precise. "Excuse me," I said, "how long has this library been here?" She turned slowly. "Since the town was founded." "When was that?" She paused. 1923. "You know the exact year?" "Yes." Her response was immediate this time, but her tone remained flat. No pride, no enthusiasm, just fact. "Have you always lived here?" I asked. "Yes." "Do you like it?" Another pause. This one lasted nearly 15 seconds. "It's home," she said finally, and the resemblances continued. The librarian looked like a woman I had seen sweeping the sidewalk in the first town. The man at the gas station had the same face as the mechanic I had passed the day before. Not identical, but close enough to unsettle me. I began taking photos of people, trying to be discreet. I captured faces. I documented the way they moved. I noted their interactions with each other. Everything felt choreographed, as though they were following patterns they had memorized. A woman pushed a stroller down the sidewalk. Her path was perfectly straight. She didn't adjust for uneven pavement. She didn't pause to look in store windows. She simply walked, her pace never varying. Two men stood outside the hardware store talking, but their conversation had no rhythm. One would speak, then stop. Then the other would respond. There were no interruptions, no overlapping dialogue, no natural flow. It was like watching a play performed by actors who had memorized their lines but didn't understand the characters. By mid-afternoon, I was convinced. These were not real people, or rather, they were real, but they were operating under some kind of control. They were iterations, copies, replications of the people in the first town, recreated with enough accuracy to appear normal, but with enough differences to reveal the artifice. But who had created them, and why? Chapter 5. The environmental lag. By late afternoon, I began noticing the sounds. I was sitting on a bench near the centre of the main street, watching the flow of people and vehicles. A car passed in front of me. I heard the engine first, then a fraction of a second later, I saw the vehicle move. The sound and the motion were out of sync. I stood and walked toward the post office again. As I moved, I heard my footsteps echo, but the echo came before the step, as though the sound were anticipating my movement. I stopped abruptly. The echo continued for 2 more steps. Footfalls on concrete, clear and distinct, even though I was standing still. I looked down at my shadow. It stretched behind me, long and sharp in the afternoon sun. But when I moved, it didn't follow immediately. It lagged by a fraction of a second, catching up in a smooth, delayed motion. Like a video played at slightly different speeds, layered on top of each other. The wind picked up. I felt it against my face, cool and dry, but the dust on the street didn't move. Then a moment later, it swirled in a tight circle, as though responding to a gust that had already passed. I turned in a slow circle, watching the town around me. Everything was slightly wrong. Not dramatically. Not enough to be obvious at first glance, but consistent, systematic. A town that was responding to stimuli it predicted rather than experienced. I walked to a small park area between two buildings. A tree stood in the centre, its branches moving in the breeze. But the motion was wrong. The branches swayed in perfect unison, all bending at the same angle, all returning to centre at the same moment. Real trees don't move like that. Each branch has different flexibility, different weight. They move independently, creating a complex, chaotic pattern. This tree moved like a single object, like it had been programmed to simulate wind response rather than actually experiencing it. I approached the tree and touched the bark. It felt real, rough, textured. I pressed my palm against it and felt the solidity of wood. But when I pulled my hand away, the texture remained on my skin for a moment too long, as though the sensation were lagging behind the action. I walked to the edge of the downtown area, where the buildings gave way to open lots and scattered houses. I stood still and listened. The hum I had heard earlier was louder here. It wasn't mechanical, it was rhythmic, pulsing, like a heartbeat filtered through layers of insulation. I tried to locate the source, turning slowly, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. From the ground, from the air, from the buildings themselves. I took out my phone. Still no signal. The screen flickered briefly, and for a moment I saw text appear. Location verified. Observation continues. Then it was gone. The screen returned to its normal display, showing no signal and a battery at 80%. I stared at the phone. Had I imagined it? Was it a glitch caused by the lack of signal? Or had something communicated with my device? I tried to open the camera app, thinking I could at least document what I was seeing even without a connection. The app opened, but when I tried to take a photo, nothing happened. The shutter button responded to my touch, but no image was captured. The screen showed the view through the lens, but it wouldn't save anything. I walked back toward the centre of town, my unease growing. Everything about this place felt artificial. Not in the sense of being fake, but in the sense of being constructed, designed, built to specifications for a purpose I didn't yet understand. As I walked, I noticed more inconsistencies. A dog sat on a porch, panting in the heat, but its tongue didn't move. It hung from its mouth, perfectly still, while its chest rose and fell in breathing. A flag hung from a pole, rippling in the wind. But the ripples moved in waves that were too regular, too perfect, like a computer-generated animation. A child rode a bicycle down a side street. The motion was smooth, but the child's legs pumped at a constant rate that never varied, even as the bike turned corners and navigated uneven pavement. Real cycling involves constant micro-adjustments. This looked like someone had created a simple algorithm for pedaling and applied it without variation. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the street. I watched my shadow again. It still lagged. When I raised my arm, the shadow followed a half-second later. When I jumped, my shadow remained on the ground for a moment before lifting. I was existing in two time frames simultaneously, my actions in real time, and the town's response in slightly delayed time. Or perhaps it was the opposite. Perhaps the town was experiencing time normally, and I was the anomaly. Perhaps I had stepped into a place where time moved differently, where causation followed different rules. Either way, I needed to find answers, and I had a feeling I knew where to look. Chapter 6: The Discovery in the Records Office. I found the municipal building near the centre of town. It was a 2-story structure, red brick with white trim, identical to the one I had seen in the first Mercer Springs. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the air was cool and still. The walls were lined with framed photographs of town events, parades, ribbon cuttings, school graduations. The people in the photos looked like the residents I had seen outside, but the images felt staged, as though arranged for reference rather than memory. The photos themselves were odd. Everyone in them looked directly at the camera. There were no candid shots. No one caught mid-laugh or mid-motion. Everyone stood in perfect poses, their expressions neutral, their hands positioned at their sides or clasped in front of them. In one photo labelled 4th of July Celebration, Year 2000, 20 people stood in a perfect line, holding small American flags. Behind them, I could see floats and decorations, but the people themselves looked more like they were posing for a corporate photo than celebrating a holiday. I walked down a narrow hallway until I found a door labelled Records. Inside, rows of filing cabinets lined the walls. A desk sat in the centre of the room, covered with ledgers and binders. Everything was meticulously organised. Each drawer was labelled with date ranges and document types. Each binder was colour-coded and indexed. I opened the nearest cabinet and began pulling files. Census records, property deeds, business licenses. Everything was labelled and organised, but as I read through them, inconsistencies emerged. The census for the year 2000 listed the population as 2,100. The same number as the first town, but the names were different. Not entirely. Some matched, others were variations. John Miller in one town, Jonathan Miller in the other. Elizabeth Chen. Same name, but the address was listed slightly differently. One lived at number 23 Oak Street, the other at number 25 Oak Street. I pulled more files, birth records, death records, marriage licenses. The pattern continued. Names that were similar but not identical. Dates that were close but offset by a few days. Addresses that matched the town's layout but with small variations. I found a ledger marked Municipal Events. It listed town meetings, elections, and local decisions. I cross-referenced the dates with notes I'd taken from the first town's records, which I had photographed during my visit. The events matched, but the dates were off by 3 to 5 days. A town meeting held on March 10th in the first location was recorded as March 13th in the second. A school fundraiser on June 5th appeared as June 8th. An election held on November 3rd was documented as November 6th. The second town was experiencing events that had already occurred in the first, not simultaneously, but in sequence, as though it were following a script written elsewhere. I found another ledger, this one marked Infrastructure Maintenance. It listed repairs to roads, buildings, and utilities. The entries were detailed. Repaired water main on First Street. Replaced section of pipe measuring 12 feet. Completed work on April 18th. I cross-referenced this with my notes from the first town. The same repair was documented there, but the date was April 15th. 3 days earlier, everything in the second town was happening 3 to 5 days after it happened in the first town. I spent 2 hours going through files, documenting every discrepancy I could find. The pattern was consistent. The second town was a delayed mirror of the first, not a simultaneous copy, but a sequential one. I found a map on the wall. It showed the town's layout, streets, buildings, lots. Everything matched the satellite images I had studied. But in the corner, handwritten in faint pencil, was a notation. Primary grid, observation frame active. Below it, another line. Iteration 7. Temporal offset, -4 days. I stared at it for a long time. Then I took a photo with my phone, even though I knew it probably wouldn't save. But this time, it did. The image appeared in my gallery, clear and sharp. I examined the map more closely. In addition to the standard street labels, there were other markings, small symbols in various locations. A triangle near the school, a circle near the post office, a square near the hardware store. I pulled out my notebook and sketched the symbols and their locations. Then I noticed something else. Near each symbol was a small number. The triangle had the number 4, the circle had the number 7, the square had the number 3. I didn't know what they meant, but I documented them anyway. In a file drawer labelled Special Projects, I found something even more disturbing. A folder containing photographs, aerial shots of the town, but not taken from an airplane or drone. The angle was wrong, too high, too vertical, as though taken from directly above, from a height of several miles. And in some of the photos, I could see both towns, the first Mercer Springs and the second one, visible in the same frame, separated by the 3 miles of desert between them. But the way they appeared suggested they were being photographed simultaneously by something hovering directly between them. The photos were dated. The most recent was from 3 weeks ago. The oldest was from 6 months ago. Whatever was observing this town, whatever had created this duplicate, had been doing so for at least half a year. I photographed the aerial images with my phone. Then I returned everything to its place and left the records office. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky had turned deep orange, fading to purple at the edges. The streetlights began to come on, one by one, in perfect sequence from east to west. I stood on the sidewalk and watched the town prepare for night. Lights appeared in windows. People walked home from work. A few cars drove slowly down Main Street. Everything looked normal, but I now knew it wasn't. This was an observation site, a research facility disguised as a town, and I had stumbled into it. Chapter 7. The realization. I sat in my car at the edge of town as the sun dipped below the horizon. The sky turned deep purple, then black. Stars appeared, more than I had ever seen in the first town. The streetlights cast pools of yellow glow on the empty streets. I thought about everything I had discovered. The iterations of people, the delayed responses, the environmental lag, the records that showed a town living 3 to 5 days behind another, the aerial photographs taken from an impossible height, the notation about observation frames and temporal offsets. This wasn't a copy. It wasn't a twin town. It was something else entirely. It was a buffer, a controlled environment, a place designed to replicate the first town, closely enough to study it without interference. Someone, or something, was watching Mercer Springs. Not the people individually, not their thoughts or dreams, not their private moments or personal struggles, but their systems. The way they organised, the way they governed, the way they interacted, the way a community functioned as a whole. The second town was a simulation, but not a digital one. It was physical, real, tangible, built to observe how a small community operated when replicated in near-perfect detail. Think about it. If you wanted to understand how an ant colony works, you don't study individual ants. You observe the colony as a system. You watch how they organise labour, how they distribute resources, how they respond to threats, how they communicate and coordinate without central control. That's what was happening here. Mercer Springs was being studied as a system, and the second town was the observation site, a place where the system could be replicated and monitored without the subjects knowing they were being watched. The 3 to 5 day delay made sense now. It allowed the observers to see what happened in the first town, then recreate those events in the second town to study them in detail, to analyse them, to understand the patterns and processes that governed human social organisation, and the people, the iterations. They weren't robots or clones, they were something else, constructs maybe, entities created to fulfill specific roles within the system. They looked human, they moved like humans, they spoke like humans, but they were simplified, streamlined, reduced to the essential functions needed to maintain the system. They were human enough to make the simulation work, but artificial enough to be controlled. And the subtle differences, the lags, the inconsistencies, those were the markers of observation, the adjustments made to test variables, to see how systems responded to minor changes. What happens if you delay a person's response by 2 seconds? What happens if you change the colour of a building? What happens if you shift an event by 3 days? Those were experiments, tests to understand the parameters of human social systems. I thought about the notation I had found. Observation frame active. This wasn't permanent. It was a study, a temporary installation designed to gather data. And when the study was complete, when enough information had been collected, the second town would be dismantled, or moved, or erased, and no one would ever know it had been there. The satellite images would be scrubbed, the records would be deleted, the duplicate listing on the map would disappear, everything would return to normal, and the first Mercer Springs would continue its existence, unaware that it had been observed, unaware that it had been replicated, unaware that someone or something had learned everything there was to know about how it functioned. I started the engine. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of this place before whoever or whatever was running this observation decided I was a problem. But as I pulled onto the main street, I realised something terrifying. They already knew I was here. They had known from the moment I arrived. The text on my phone. The way my photos were suddenly allowed to save. The unlocked records office with everything perfectly organised and waiting to be found. They had let me discover the truth. The question was, why? Chapter 8. The exit that closes. I started the engine and pulled onto the main street, heading toward the road I had taken into town. The GPS was still offline. I relied on memory, retracing the route I'd followed that morning, past the school, past the residential streets, toward the edge of town, where the pavement gave way to dirt roads. But the road had changed. Where there had been a left turn onto the gravel road, there was now only a continuation of the street. I drove forward, expecting to reach the edge of town. Instead, the street curved gently back toward the centre. I stopped and reversed, trying a different route. I turned down a side street that should have led to the county road, but it didn't. It curved back on itself, depositing me once again on Main Street. I tried another route, same result. I tried the highway route. The road appeared in my memory, a straight shot east toward the highway I had taken into the area. But when I drove toward it, the intersection didn't exist. The street simply ended at a vacant lot. I parked and got out. The hum was louder now. It surrounded me, pressing against my ears like a physical presence. The streetlights flickered in unison, dimming and brightening in a slow rhythm. The whole town seemed to pulse with that strange vibration. I walked to the edge of the lot where the highway should have been. There was nothing, just open desert stretching into the darkness. But it wasn't normal desert. It was too perfect, too uniform. The ground was absolutely flat, without any of the natural variation you would expect. No rocks, no shrubs, no animal tracks, just flat, empty earth, extending as far as I could see in the moonlight. Behind me, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, measured. I turned. A man stood at the corner of the nearest building. He looked like the clerk from the hardware store. Same build, same general appearance, but his face was expressionless, completely neutral. He didn't speak, he just watched. More figures appeared. One by one they emerged from buildings and side streets, silent, still. They stood at even intervals along the street, all facing me. I counted them. 20, then 30, then more. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They just stood there, watching. I got back in the car and drove. I didn't care which direction anymore. I just drove. The streets rearranged themselves. I turned left and ended up heading north. I turned right and found myself back at the diner. I tried to navigate by the stars, but when I looked up, they had shifted. Constellations I knew were in different positions. The North Star was in the wrong place. The town was actively resisting my departure. Roads moved, intersections changed, landmarks relocated. It was like navigating a maze that constantly reconfigured itself. I drove for what felt like hours, but my car's clock showed only 20 minutes had passed. Time itself was behaving strangely. Minutes stretched and compressed. My sense of duration became unreliable. At one point, I found myself on a street I had driven down 3 times before, but each time it looked different. The buildings changed sides. The trees appeared and disappeared. Even the pavement texture shifted from asphalt to concrete to something that looked almost like packed earth. I saw the figures again. They had multiplied, hundreds of them now, lining every street, all facing inward, all watching. Their faces were identical, perfect copies of each other. Not variations anymore, but exact duplicates, as though the pretense of individuality had been abandoned. The hum grew louder. It resonated in my chest, in my bones. It felt like the entire town was vibrating at a frequency just below what ears could process, but bodies could feel. And then suddenly, it stopped. The hum cut off. The figures disappeared. The streetlights returned to normal. And ahead of me, I saw the road. The gravel road I had used to enter the town. The gap had opened. I didn't hesitate. I accelerated, not looking back, not questioning why the exit had suddenly appeared. I just drove. The gravel road stretched ahead, straight and clear. Then the asphalt appeared. Then the county road. Then the highway. I drove until the lights of the second Mercer Springs disappeared completely in my rearview mirror. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't escaped, that I had been released, that my departure had been allowed. Chapter 9. Return to the first town. I reached the first Mercer Springs just before midnight. The town was quiet. A few lights glowed in windows. The street lights cast their familiar yellow glow on empty streets. Everything looked exactly as it had when I first arrived. I parked in the same spot I had used 2 days before and walked down the main street. The diner was closed, but I could see inside through the window. The same layout, the same booths and counter, but the colours were right now. The deep red vinyl, the correct tile pattern. This was the original. I stopped a man walking his dog. He looked at me curiously. "Evening," he said. "Excuse me," I said. "Is there another town near here? Same name?" He tilted his head. "Another Mercer Springs?" Yes, he shook his head slowly. No, just this one. Where'd you hear that? I saw something on a map, he chuckled. Maps are wrong sometimes. GPS gets confused out here. Happened to me once. Took me 10 miles in the wrong direction. He started to walk away, then paused. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine, I said. Just tired. He nodded and continued down the street with his dog. I walked to the post office and looked up at the building. Same brick, same windows, same flag, but everything felt solid here. Real. The shadows fell correctly. The sounds matched the movements. Time flowed normally. I returned to my car and pulled out my phone. The signal had returned. I opened the map application and searched for the second town. It was gone. The satellite images showed only one Mercer Springs. The duplicate listing had vanished. The coordinates I'd written down led to empty desert. I zoomed in on the area where the second town had been. The satellite view showed nothing. No buildings, no streets, no water tower, no evidence that anything had ever been there. Just flat, empty land with scattered brush and geological features. I checked the date on the image. It was from 2 weeks ago, but that didn't make sense. I had been in that town hours ago. It had been real. I had touched the buildings. I had walked the streets. I had spoken to the people, unless the second town wasn't permanent, unless it could be concealed, hidden from satellites and aerial observation, unless whatever technology created it could also mask it from detection. I sat in the car, staring at my phone. I pulled up the photos I had taken, the records office, the aerial photographs, the notation about observation frames. They were all there, clear and sharp, proof that I hadn't imagined it. But if I showed them to anyone, what would they see? Would they see what I saw? Or would they see something else? Would the images be altered, sanitized, made to show nothing unusual? I decided not to risk it. Not yet. I would wait until I was home, until I was somewhere safe. Then I would examine everything carefully and decide what to do with the information. I started the engine and drove out of town, heading back toward the highway. As I drove, I watched the mirrors. I watched the roads. I watched for any sign that I was being followed or observed. But everything seemed normal. Traffic was sparse but present. The highway was well maintained. Rest stops appeared at regular intervals. The world outside Mercer Springs was exactly as it should be. I drove through the night, stopping only once for gas and coffee. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figures standing in the street. I saw the town that shouldn't exist. I saw the notation on the map. Observation frame active. What did that mean? How many observation frames were there? How many towns were being studied this way? How many communities had been replicated without their knowledge? And more importantly, why? What was so interesting about human social organisation that it warranted this level of study? What could be learned from observing a small town that couldn't be learned from simply asking questions or conducting surveys? Unless the point wasn't to learn what people thought. The point was to learn what people did, to observe behaviour in its natural context, to understand systems as they actually functioned, not as people reported them functioning. It made sense in a disturbing way. If you wanted to truly understand a civilization, you wouldn't study individuals. You would study systems. You would observe how people organised themselves, how they made decisions, how they distributed resources, how they resolved conflicts. And the best way to do that would be to replicate the system and watch it operate under controlled conditions. That's what the second Mercer Springs was. A laboratory, a place where human social systems could be observed and analysed without interference. And I had stumbled into it. Chapter 10. The Final Evidence. I drove home the next day. I didn't stop except for necessities. I didn't talk to anyone. I just drove. For weeks afterward, I tried to put it out of my mind. I told myself it had been a hallucination, a trick of exhaustion or dehydration, some kind of psychological episode brought on by isolation and long hours of driving. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see, that I had discovered something that was meant to remain hidden. I went about my normal life. I returned to work, I saw friends, I maintained my routines, but everything felt slightly off. I found myself watching people more carefully, observing their interactions, looking for patterns, wondering if the systems I was part of were being studied in the same way. Then one evening, about 3 weeks after my trip, I decided to review the dashcam footage. I had installed the camera months earlier for insurance purposes. It recorded continuously, saving files in 6-hour segments. I hadn't thought about it during the trip, but now I remembered that it had been running the entire time. I found the file from the day I had visited the second town. I watched it from the beginning. The drive, the turn onto the gravel road, the approach to the main street. And then I saw it. For 3 frames, less than 1/10 of a second, the image split. 2 skylines appeared on the screen, overlapping, one slightly above the other, both showing the same buildings, the same street, but offset, like a double exposure photograph, like 2 realities existing in the same space. I paused the video and examined the frames. The overlap was subtle but unmistakable. 2 towns, 2 versions of the same place, occupying the same visual field but separated by something invisible. Then it resolved into a single image, the second town. Solid, real. But for those 3 frames, I had captured something else. Evidence of the transition. Proof that the second town existed in a different state than normal reality. I saved the frames and enhanced them. I adjusted the contrast. I increased the resolution as much as the video quality allowed. And in the overlapping section, I saw something else. Between the 2 towns, in the space where the images overlapped, there was a structure, barely visible, more of a suggestion than a solid form. But it was there, something large, something geometric, something that didn't belong in an empty desert. I spent hours analysing those frames. I compared them to other sections of the video. I looked for evidence of corruption or digital artifacts, but the frames were clean. Whatever I had captured was real, at least in the sense that the camera had recorded it. I made backups, multiple copies on different drives. I uploaded encrypted versions to cloud storage. I wasn't going to lose this evidence, but I also wasn't sure what to do with it. Who would believe me? What could I possibly tell anyone that wouldn't sound like conspiracy theory nonsense? I considered contacting the media, local news stations, investigative journalists. But what would I say? I found a town that exists in 2 places at once. I have video evidence of overlapping realities. They would dismiss me immediately. I considered contacting the government. But which agency? And what if they already knew? What if they were involved? What if the observation site was a government project? I was left with only one option. Document everything. Preserve the evidence and wait. Wait for someone else to discover what I had discovered. Wait for corroboration. Wait for a pattern to emerge that was too large to ignore. Because I didn't believe Mercer Springs was unique. I didn't believe it was the only town being observed. The notation I had found suggested this was iteration 7. That meant there had been at least 6 others, probably more. How many towns were being studied right now? How many communities were being replicated and analysed without their knowledge? And what would happen when the studies were complete? Would the observation sites be dismantled? Would the evidence be erased? Would anyone ever know this had happened? I spent the next several weeks researching. I looked for other reports of duplicate towns, strange map errors, satellite anomalies, anything that might suggest a pattern. I found a few things. Reports from hikers who claimed to have found towns that weren't on any map. Stories from truck drivers who swore they had driven through the same town twice on a route that shouldn't have allowed it. Forum posts from people who noticed discrepancies in satellite images. But nothing conclusive. Nothing that couldn't be explained away as confusion or error or misidentification. Still, the reports existed, and they covered a wide geographic area. Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, parts of Colorado and Wyoming, all remote locations, all areas with low population density, all places where an observation site could be established without attracting attention. I marked each location on a map, and when I was done, I saw a pattern. The reports formed a rough grid, with sites approximately 60 to 80 miles apart. That suggested scale. That suggested organisation. That suggested a systematic study covering thousands of square miles. This wasn't a single experiment. This was a network. Epilogue. The experiment that moves on. I never went back to Mercer Springs. I considered it. Multiple times I packed my car and planned the route, but I couldn't bring myself to return. Part of me was afraid of what I might find, afraid that the second town would be gone, erased, leaving me with nothing but questions and memories that no one would believe. But part of me was afraid of the opposite, afraid that the second town would still be there, that I would see it again, that I would be drawn back into something I didn't understand and couldn't control. So I stayed away. I monitored the satellite images. I watched for changes. I kept the evidence secure and waited for someone else to find what I had found. I think about it often. The second town, the iterations of people, the environmental lag, the notation in the records office, the overlapping skylines in the dashcam footage. I think about what it means. We like to imagine that if we were being observed, it would be obvious. Spacecraft in the sky, figures in the night, abductions and experiments, dramatic interventions that we couldn't possibly miss. But what if observation doesn't work that way? What if it's subtle? What if the goal isn't to study individuals, but systems? Not people, but societies. Not thoughts, but behaviours. If you wanted to understand how a civilization functions, you wouldn't need to dissect its members. You wouldn't need to probe their minds or examine their bodies. You would need to replicate their structures, their routines, their interactions. You would build a copy, not perfect, just accurate enough to learn from, close enough to observe the patterns, detailed enough to understand the processes. And when you were done, you would move on to another location, another community, another system to study. The second Mercer Springs is gone now. I know because I check the satellite images regularly. There's nothing there, just empty desert. Just the flat, featureless landscape that was there before. But I don't think the experiment ended. I think it moved to another town, another community, another place where people live and work and organise without realising they're being studied. And maybe that's the most unsettling part. Not that we were observed, not that we were studied, but that we were copied, not perfectly, just accurately enough to understand how we function, enough to analyse our systems, enough to learn whatever it was they wanted to learn. And somewhere, something learned what it needed to know from Mercer Springs, from the 2,000 people who live there, who go about their daily lives, who organise their community and maintain their systems without ever knowing they were replicated. Somewhere, the data has been collected, the patterns have been analysed, the processes have been understood, and the observation has moved on to the next site, the next town, the next system. I wonder sometimes if I'll find another one, if I'll be driving through some remote area and see the duplicate listing on a map, if I'll have the courage to investigate again, or if I'll simply drive past pretending I didn't see it. I wonder if anyone else has found what I found, if there are others out there with the same evidence, the same questions, the same fears, if we're all keeping silent, afraid of being dismissed, afraid of being targeted, afraid of what it means. But mostly, I wonder about the purpose. Why study us this way? What can be learned from observing small-town social systems? What is so valuable about understanding how humans organise themselves that it warrants this level of effort? And I wonder if the answer would terrify me more than the observation itself. Because if something is studying us this carefully, this systematically, this thoroughly, then they're preparing for something. Learning, planning, getting ready for whatever comes next. And when that time comes, they'll understand us better than we understand ourselves. They'll know our patterns, our processes, our systems, our weaknesses, our strengths, everything. Because they've been watching, not from a distance, not from above, but from within. From places we've built ourselves, from copies of our own communities. The second Mercer Springs may be gone, but the observation continues. In other towns, other places, other systems being replicated and studied. And we'll never know. We'll go about our lives, maintaining our routines, organising our communities, completely unaware that somewhere a few miles away a copy exists, a mirror of our reality, a laboratory where our systems are being analysed, not perfectly copied, just accurately enough. And that's what haunts me most, not the existence of the observation, but the precision of it, the care taken to make it almost undetectable, the subtle differences that reveal the artifice only to those who look closely enough. They could have made it perfect. They have the technology. They have the capability. But they didn't. They left markers. They left clues. They left evidence. And I can't help but wonder if that was intentional. If I was meant to find the second town, if the unlocked records office and the saved photographs and the text on my phone were all deliberate, if I was being tested, observed, studied in the same way Mercer Springs was being studied, a subject who discovered the experiment and had to decide what to do with that knowledge. And now I carry that knowledge, that burden, that question that will never be fully answered. The town that appeared twice is gone, but the questions remain. And somewhere in a remote corner of the American West, another observation site is operating. Another town is being studied. Another community is being replicated. And the people there have no idea. They go about their lives. They raise their families. They work their jobs. They maintain their systems, completely unaware that a few miles away an iteration of their town exists. A copy that follows their patterns with a 3-day delay. A laboratory where their community is being analysed by something that watches but never reveals itself, until someone like me stumbles into it and sees what shouldn't be seen, and has to live with the knowledge that we're not alone in observing ourselves, that something else is watching, learning, understanding, and when they're done, they'll move on, leaving no trace except in the memories of a few people who saw too much and can never quite prove what they found. The town that appeared twice, a place that existed and didn't exist, a reality that overlapped with our own for just long enough to be glimpsed and then disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. But it was there. I know it was. I have the evidence. I have the photos. I have the video. I have the memories burned into my mind with perfect clarity. And someday, maybe someone will believe me. Maybe someone else will find another observation site. Maybe the pattern will become too large to ignore. Until then, I watch the maps. I monitor the satellites. I look for the duplicates, the anomalies, the places that exist twice, because they're out there. I know they are, hidden in plain sight, operating in the spaces between our awareness and our understanding, studying us, learning from us, preparing for whatever comes next, and we'll never know until it's too late. The town that appeared twice is gone, but the observation continues, and somewhere right now another copy is being built, another system is being replicated, another community is being studied, and the people there have no idea, just like Mercer Springs has no idea, just like we all have no idea what's being learned about us in places that shouldn't exist, but do.
There are moments when the universe tears open its curtain and shows you something that changes everything you thought you knew about reality. For Captain Jorge Polanco and the 127 souls aboard Aerolíneas Argentina's Flight 674, that moment came on a clear winter night over the Andes Mountains. What began as a routine landing became something that would challenge every assumption about who controls our skies and whether we are truly alone when we fly through them. July 31st, 1995. The date would be seared into Jorge Polanco's memory for the rest of his life. The Boeing 737 hummed steadily through the night sky, carrying its passengers from Buenos Aires toward the mountain resort city of San Carlos de Bariloche. Jorge sat in the left seat of the cockpit, his hands resting comfortably on the controls. At 47 years old, with over 10,000 hours of flight time logged in his career, he had landed at Bariloche more times than he could count. The approach was familiar, almost meditative. The Andes rose like dark sentinels on either side of the valley, their snow-capped peaks gleaming silver under the moonlight. First Officer Marcelo Vidal occupied the right seat, a younger pilot with 5 years of commercial flying under his belt. They had flown together dozens of times, and their cockpit communication had the easy rhythm of experienced partners who trusted each other implicitly. Bariloche Tower, this is Aerolíneas 674, descending through flight level 200, Marcelo transmitted, his voice steady and professional. The response crackled through their headsets. Aerolíneas 674, Bariloche Tower, you're cleared for visual approach runway 13, wind calm, visibility unlimited, altimeter 2 992. Jorge nodded, adjusting the altimeter setting. beautiful night for it," he commented, glancing out at the crystal-clear sky. Stars blazed overhead with an intensity that city dwellers never experienced. The Milky Way, a river of light stretching across the heavens. Behind them, in the passenger cabin, people dozed, read, or chatted quietly. Families returning from visits to the capital. Tourists eager to hit the ski slopes. Business travellers reviewing documents under reading lights. All of them blissfully unaware that their routine flight was about to become anything but routine. The plane descended steadily, dropping through 15,000 feet. Jorge began configuring the aircraft for landing, calling for flaps and landing gear. The familiar whir and thunk of mechanical systems responded to his commands. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should. That's when Marcelo saw it first. "Jorge," he said, his voice carrying a strange note that made the captain's attention snap toward him. "Look at your 9 o'clock position. Low. What is that?" Jorge turned his head to the left, peering out through the cockpit window, into the darkness. At first he saw nothing unusual, just the distant lights of scattered mountain communities twinkling like earthbound stars. Then his eyes caught it. A light. But not like any light he had ever seen from an aircraft. It glowed with an intense, pulsating luminescence that shifted through shades of orange, yellow, and white. The glow seemed to emanate from within something, not just reflect off a surface. And it was moving, paralleling their flight path at what appeared to be the same altitude. "I see it," Jorge said slowly, his experienced pilot's brain already running through possibilities. Another aircraft. But the light pattern was all wrong. A helicopter. Too high, and moving too fast. A drone. In 1995, drones were barely a concept. Certainly not something flying at 10,000 feet in Argentine airspace. "It's matching our speed," Marcelo observed, and Jorge heard the slight tension creeping into his first officer's voice. Jorge watched the object for several seconds, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The glow intensified, then dimmed, then intensified again in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. And it was getting closer. "Bariloche Tower, this is Aerolínea 674, Jorge transmitted, keeping his voice deliberately calm and professional. "We have an unidentified object pacing our aircraft at approximately 9 o'clock position. Can you confirm any traffic in our vicinity?" There was a pause, longer than normal. Then the tower controller's voice came back, and Jorge could hear the confusion in it. 674, we show no other traffic in your area. Can you describe what you're seeing?" Jorge chose his words carefully. "It appears to be a glowing disc-shaped object, orange to white in colour. Distance approximately 1 mile. It is matching our course and speed." Another pause. Then, 674, stand by. We are checking with approach control and military operations. The object moved closer. Jorge could see it more clearly now, and what he saw made his pulse quicken despite his years of training to remain calm in any situation. The thing was massive, easily the size of a commercial airliner. It had a distinct disc shape, rounded at the edges, with that strange internal glow pulsing across its surface. There were no visible windows, no navigation lights, no identifying markings. Just that hypnotic, shifting luminescence. "It's beautiful," Marcelo whispered, almost to himself. Jorge understood what he meant. Despite the strangeness, despite the violation of everything they knew about aviation, there was something mesmerizing about the object. It moved with a fluid grace that defied physics, adjusting its position with minute precision that no aircraft Jorge had ever flown could match. The radio crackled again. "Aerolínea 674, this is Bariloche Tower. We have visual confirmation of an unidentified object in your vicinity. Military Operations reports that they have a patrol aircraft in the area. They're attempting visual contact now." "Roger that," Jorge acknowledged, his eyes never leaving the glowing disc. They were passing through 8,000 feet now, still descending toward the airport. The object maintained its relative position, hovering just off their left wing like an escort fighter. but unlike any escort fighter Jorge had ever seen. In the cabin behind them, some passengers had noticed the strange light outside their windows. A murmur of voices rose, people pointing, pressing their faces against the small oval windows. A flight attendant appeared at the cockpit door, her face pale. "Captain, the passengers are asking about the light outside. What should I tell them?" Jorge glanced back at her, seeing the barely controlled fear in her eyes. "Tell them we have the situation under control and that we are in communication with air traffic control. Ask everyone to remain seated with their seat belts fastened." She nodded and disappeared back into the cabin, though Jorge could hear the rising pitch of concerned voices even through the closed door. 674, this is Argentine Air Force Patrol. Echo Bravo 3-1, a new voice cut through on the radio, crisp with military precision. "We have you on radar and are approaching from your 6 o'clock position for visual confirmation of the reported object." Echo Bravo 31674. "The object is currently maintaining position off our left wing, approximately 1 mile, Jorge responded. Seconds ticked by. Jorge could feel sweat beginning to form on his forehead, despite the cool temperature in the cockpit. They were at 6,000 feet now, beginning their final descent profile. The runway at Bariloche should be coming into view soon. 674, Echo Bravo 31. We have visual contact, confirming unidentified object matching your description. We are observing from 3 miles behind your position. The military confirmation sent a chill through Jorge's body. This wasn't a misidentification. This wasn't a weather balloon or a satellite or Venus or any of the usual explanations. Multiple professional observers were seeing the same thing. An object that defied conventional explanation, pacing a commercial airliner through the night sky. "What do you think it wants?" Marcelo asked quietly. Jorge shook his head. "I don't know, but let's focus on getting this plane on the ground safely." The object seemed to pulse brighter, as if responding to their conversation. Then, with a movement so sudden and smooth it seemed to defy inertia, it accelerated forward, moving from their 9 o'clock position to directly ahead of them. "It's moving!" Marcelo exclaimed. Jorge watched as the disc positioned itself approximately 2 miles in front of the aircraft, slightly above their flight path. It hovered there, stationary relative to the ground now, no longer matching their speed. They were approaching it rapidly as they continued their descent. "Bariloche Tower, the object has moved forward of our position," Jorge reported, his voice tight with tension. 674, we have it on radar now. Continue your approach, we are monitoring the situation. 4,000 feet. 3,000. The lights of Bariloche spread out below them, a scattered constellation of human habitation nestled in the Andean Valley. Jorge could see the airport now, the familiar layout of taxiways and buildings. Any moment the runway lights should come into view. The glowing disc maintained its position ahead of them, a strange beacon in the night sky. "Gear down, final flaps," Jorge commanded, and Marcelo complied. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the landing gear extended and locked into place. 2,000 feet. And then the world went dark. Exit 2. The impossible maneuver. One moment, the runway lights were clearly visible ahead, a welcoming line of white brilliance marking their path to safety. The next moment, they were gone. Completely, utterly gone. "What the—" Marcelo's voice cut off as both pilots stared in disbelief at the blackness where the runway should be. Jorge's training took over instantly. "Tower, 674, we have lost all visual reference to the runway. Confirm runway lights are operational." The response came back immediately, and Jorge could hear the confusion and alarm in the controller's voice. 674, we show total power failure to runway lighting systems. We are attempting to restore power. Recommend executing missed approach procedure. Jorge's mind raced. They were at 1,500 feet, fully configured for landing, committed to the approach. A missed approach meant retracting gear and flaps, adding power, climbing back up to begin another approach. Standard procedure. Safe procedure. except they had an unidentified object hovering in the darkness ahead of them. "Marcelo, prepare for missed approach. I'm going to—" He never finished the sentence. The glowing disc, which had been hovering stationary ahead of them, suddenly dropped in altitude with impossible speed. In less than 2 seconds, it descended from its position at 2,000 feet to directly over where the runway should be. And as it positioned itself, it changed. The pulsating glow intensified, became focused, directed. Brilliant beams of white light shot downward from the disc, illuminating the runway with perfect precision. The entire landing strip was bathed in clear, steady light, every marking visible, every boundary defined. The disc had become their runway lights. "Madre de Dios," Marcelo breathed, his voice barely audible. Jorge stared at the impossible scene before him. His hands remained on the controls, the aircraft continuing its descent, but his brain struggled to process what he was seeing. The object was showing them where to land. It was deliberately, purposefully illuminating their path. 674 Tower. Are you seeing what we're seeing? The controller's voice had lost all professional composure, rising with disbelief. "Affirmative," Jorge managed to say. "The object is illuminating the runway." A longer pause, then, 674, you are cleared to land if you determine it is safe to do so. Emergency equipment is standing by. If it is safe to do so? What a question. Was it safe to land a commercial airliner guided by lights from an unidentified flying object? Was any part of this situation remotely safe? But Jorge could see the runway clearly now, better than he sometimes could with the standard lighting. The disc maintained its position perfectly, rock steady despite any wind that might be present, and they were already committed, too low and too slow to safely execute a missed approach, with unknown object positions in the air around them. "We're landing," Jorge decided, his voice firm. His hands made the minute adjustments necessary to keep the aircraft on the proper glide slope. The ground rose to meet them, details becoming clearer in the strange but effective illumination from above. He could see the threshold markers, the centre line, the touchdown zone markings. 1,000 feet, 500, 300. The disc remained stationary, its beams of light unwavering. 50 feet, 40, 30. Jorge pulled back slightly on the yoke, flaring the aircraft, slowing its descent. 20 feet, 10. The main landing gear touched the runway with barely a bump, a perfect landing. Jorge deployed the thrust reversers, feeling the deceleration press him forward against his seatbelt. The nose gear settled onto the pavement. They were down, safe. The instant the aircraft's wheels touched the ground, the runway lights snapped back on. The standard white lights blazed to life as if nothing had ever been wrong with them, as if the power failure had been a momentary glitch, and simultaneously the disc's illumination cut off. The object shot upward with acceleration that defied everything Jorge understood about physics. One moment it was there, hovering over the runway. The next moment it was gone, vanishing into the night sky at a speed that left no trail, no exhaust, nothing but a memory of that strange, pulsating glow. Jorge brought the aircraft to a complete stop on the runway, his hands trembling slightly on the controls. Behind him, he could hear applause breaking out in the cabin, passengers relieved to be safely on the ground, most of them unaware of just how unusual their landing had been. "Bariloche Tower, 674 is safely on the runway," Jorge transmitted, surprised at how steady his voice sounded. 674 Roger. Taxi to the terminal via taxiway Charlie. And Captain, we need you to make a full report to airport authorities immediately upon parking. Understood. As Jorge taxied the aircraft toward the terminal, neither he nor Marcelo spoke. What was there to say? They had just been saved from a potential disaster by something that shouldn't exist. The object had deliberately intervened, had actively prevented what could have been a catastrophic accident. Why? What intelligence guided that disc? What purpose could it possibly have in protecting a commercial flight full of civilians? Jorge didn't have answers. He only knew what he had experienced, what he had seen with his own eyes, confirmed by his first officer, by the tower, by military observers, and by over 100 passengers who had witnessed at least part of the encounter. As the aircraft came to a final stop at the gate, and Jorge began the shutdown procedures, he looked up through the cockpit windscreen at the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, something was watching. Something with capabilities that made human technology look primitive by comparison. Something that, at least on this night, had chosen to help rather than harm. But the question that would haunt Jorge Polanco for years to come was simple and terrifying. What did it want? Act 3. Multiple sources confirmed the terminal at Bariloche Airport buzzed with activity that had nothing to do with normal flight operations. Within 20 minutes of Flight 674 parking at the gate, the scene had transformed into something resembling a disaster response. Except there had been no disaster. There had only been the impossible. Jorge stood in the airport manager's office, a cramped space with windows overlooking the ramp where his aircraft sat like evidence at a crime scene. Except no crime had been committed. Only a mystery had unfolded, one that dozens of witnesses were now struggling to explain. The airport manager, Gustavo Herrera, was a heavy-set man in his 50s who looked like he had aged 5 years in the last hour. He sat behind his desk, telephone receiver pressed to his ear, nodding and occasionally interjecting "sí" or "entiendo," while someone on the other end apparently delivered instructions. Marcelo stood beside Jorge, his arms crossed, his expression still showing the shock of what they had experienced. In the corner of the room, 2 men in Argentine Air Force uniforms waited silently, their faces professionally neutral but their eyes sharp with interest. Through the window, Jorge could see passengers from his flight being herded into a separate area of the terminal. Airport security personnel were politely but firmly requesting that everyone remain available for questioning. Some passengers were agitated, demanding to be allowed to leave. Others seemed eager to talk, gesturing animatedly as they recounted what they had seen. Gustavo hung up the phone and rubbed his face with both hands. That was the regional aviation director. He's on his way from Buenos Aires, should be here by morning. He looked up at Jorge and Marcelo. You understand that this is an extremely unusual situation. That's an understatement, Jorge replied dryly. One of the Air Force officers stepped forward. He was tall and lean, with lieutenant's insignia on his uniform. Captain Polanco, I'm Lieutenant Fernando Ruiz from the Argentine Air Defense Command. My commanding officer has asked me to conduct preliminary interviews regarding the incident. Would you walk me through exactly what you observed, in sequence? Jorge took a breath and began recounting the encounter from the moment he and Marcelo first spotted the glowing object. He kept his description factual, avoiding speculation or interpretation. Just the facts. What he saw, what he did, what the object did in response. Lieutenant Ruiz took notes in a small leather-bound notebook, occasionally asking questions for clarification. When Jorge reached the part about the object illuminating the runway, Ruiz looked up sharply. You're certain it was the object providing the illumination, not emergency backup lighting or some other system? I'm certain, Jorge said firmly. I've landed at this airport hundreds of times. I know what the lighting systems look like. This was different. The light came from above, not from the ground, and it moved with the object. Gustavo interjected. Our maintenance chief confirms that the runway lighting system experienced a complete power failure. Every circuit breaker tripped simultaneously. He's never seen anything like it. The system has redundant power sources, backup generators. Everything failed at once. And when did power restore? Ruiz asked. The exact moment the aircraft touched down, Gustavo said. Our control tower supervisor logged it. The runway lights came back on simultaneously with touchdown, and all the circuit breakers reset themselves. Again, that's not how the system is designed to work. Ruiz wrote this down carefully. And the object's departure. Instantaneous, Jorge said. It was there, and then it wasn't. The acceleration was unlike anything I've ever seen. No aircraft can move like that. Not ours anyway, Ruiz murmured almost to himself. A knock on the door interrupted them. Gustavo called out permission to enter, and a young woman in a tower controller's uniform stepped inside, looking nervous. "Excuse me, sirs. The tower supervisor asked me to bring you these." She held out several sheets of paper. "Radar printouts from the incident, and we have the radio communications recorded, of course." Ruiz took the papers and studied them intently. Jorge leaned over to look as well. The radar returns showed exactly what they had all seen. A solid target appearing beside Flight 674, pacing it, then moving ahead to position over the runway. The radar track was clear and undeniable. "This eliminates weather phenomena," Ruiz noted. "Solid radar return means solid object." "There are also 3 passenger videos," the controller added hesitantly. "Some of the passengers used their video cameras during the approach. The footage is, well, you can see the object clearly in at least 2 of them." Gustavo's eyebrows shot up. "Where are these passengers now?" "Being interviewed by security. They've been very cooperative. Several other passengers have come forward to give statements, even those without cameras. Everyone's stories are consistent." After the controller left, the second Air Force officer, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. He was older, with the insignia of a major. "Captain Polanco, I flew the patrol aircraft that confirmed your sighting. I saw the object with my own eyes, tracked it on my radar. My weapons systems officer obtained a lock on it briefly before it accelerated beyond our tracking capability." Jorge turned to face him fully. "You tried to lock weapons on it?" The major shook his head. No. We simply used our targeting radar to get more detailed information. Standard protocol when identifying unknown aircraft. The object was approximately 40 meters in diameter, disc-shaped, and was maintaining a position that would have been impossible for any conventional aircraft at that altitude and speed." "Did you see it illuminate the runway?" Marcelo asked, speaking for the first time in several minutes. "We were too far out for visual confirmation of that detail, but we saw the object ascend rapidly and position itself over the runway coordinates. Our radar registered it clearly." Lieutenant Ruiz closed his notebook. "Gentlemen, I need to be frank with you. This incident involves multiple credible witnesses, including experienced flight crew, military personnel and civilian passengers. We have radar confirmation, radio communications and video footage. This is not a case of mistaken identity or mass hysteria." "So what happens now?" Jorge asked. "Now we compile a complete report and forward it to the appropriate authorities. The Argentine Air Force takes these matters seriously. There will be a full investigation." "And will the results of that investigation be made public?" Jorge pressed. Ruiz and the major exchanged glances. The major spoke carefully. "That decision will be made at levels well above our rank. But I will tell you that the Air Force has a protocol for these incidents. They are classified according to their characteristics and the quality of evidence supporting them. And this one, the major said slowly, will likely receive one of the highest classifications, multiple military and civilian witnesses, radar confirmation, physical effects on ground systems, and most significantly, apparent intelligent control and interaction." The words hung in the air. Intelligent control and interaction. The object hadn't just appeared, it had responded. It had acted with purpose, with intention. It had saved them. Over the next several hours, Jorge and Marcelo gave their statements multiple times to multiple people. Airport security, local police, more military officers who arrived throughout the night. Each time, Jorge told the same story because it was the truth, and the truth didn't change no matter how many times he repeated it. The sun was beginning to rise over the Andes, painting the snow-capped peaks in shades of pink and gold, when Jorge was finally told he could leave. Gustavo arranged for a hotel room, as there was no way Jorge was getting back to Buenos Aires that morning. He needed sleep. He needed time to process what had happened, but sleep wouldn't come easily. In his hotel room, Jorge stood at the window, looking out at the mountains and the awakening city below. His flight bag sat on the bed behind him, his uniform jacket draped over a chair. He was still wearing his white captain shirt with the 4 stripes on the shoulders. The uniform of a professional pilot, a person trained to understand aircraft and flight and all the rational, explainable aspects of aviation. Nothing about last night had been rational or explainable. His mind kept returning to that moment when the runway lights had failed and the object had descended to take their place. The deliberateness of it, the precision. It had known exactly what to do, had understood that they needed guidance to land safely, and had provided it without hesitation. What kind of intelligence did that require? What level of technology? And most troubling of all, what did it say about humanity's place in the universe if there were beings out there with such capabilities, watching us, intervening in our affairs? Jorge's career was built on precision, on following procedures, on understanding exactly how machines worked and what they could do. The object he had encountered shattered all of those certainties. It operated according to principles he didn't understand, moved in ways that violated the physics he had studied, and demonstrated an awareness that suggested intelligence far beyond human capability. And yet, it had helped them. That was the part that Jorge couldn't stop thinking about. Whatever it was, whatever its origins or purpose, it had acted to prevent harm. That suggested something positive, something benevolent, or at least not hostile. But benevolent or not, its very existence raised terrifying questions. Who were they? What did they want? How long had they been watching? And most importantly, what came next? Jorge didn't have answers. He only knew that his life had changed. He had seen something that most people would never believe, something that challenged everything humanity thought it knew about its place in the cosmos. The sun continued to rise, indifferent to the questions that plagued him. Somewhere in that vast sky, among those distant stars, something was out there. Something that had touched his life for a brief moment, and then vanished back into the unknown. And Jorge Polanco, veteran commercial pilot with over 10,000 hours of flight time, would spend the rest of his life wondering when it might return. Est 4. The cover-up attempts. The call came at 7 in the morning, just as Jorge was finally drifting off to sleep. He fumbled for the hotel phone, his exhausted mind struggling to orient itself. Captain Polanco, this is Colonel Arturo Mendez from the Argentine Air Force Intelligence Division. I'm at the airport. I need to speak with you immediately. Jorge rubbed his eyes. Colonel, I've already given multiple statements. I've been up all night. I understand, Captain, but this cannot wait. A car will pick you up in 15 minutes. The line went dead before Jorge could protest. He stared at the phone for a moment, then dragged himself out of bed and into the shower, letting hot water wash away some of the fatigue. Something in the Colonel's tone had carried an edge that made Jorge uneasy. This wasn't another routine interview. This was something different. The car that arrived was an unmarked military vehicle with a stern-faced driver who said nothing during the ride back to the airport. Jorge was taken not to the terminal, but to a separate building on the far side of the airfield, a nondescript concrete structure that housed military operations. Inside, Colonel Mendez waited in a conference room. He was a compact man in his mid-50s, with steel grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. 2 other officers flanked him, both with insignia Jorge didn't recognise. The room itself was windowless, lit by harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Captain Polanco, thank you for coming. Mendez gestured to a chair. Please, sit. Jorge sat, feeling the weight of their stares. This wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Mendez opened a folder on the table in front of him. Jorge could see his own statements from the night before, along with what looked like official reports and transcripts. Captain, we've reviewed all the evidence from last night's incident. Your testimony, your first officer's testimony, the radar data, the passenger statements, the video footage. And, Jorge prompted when Mendez paused, and we have a problem. Mendez leaned forward. This incident has generated significant attention. Word is already spreading through aviation circles. Passengers are calling news media. We've had 3 separate television stations contact the airport asking for information. So, let them report it. It happened. Dozens of people saw it. It's not that simple, Captain. One of the other officers spoke up. There are considerations beyond just what happened. National security considerations, international relations considerations, public reaction considerations. Jorge felt anger beginning to stir beneath his exhaustion. Are you telling me you want to cover this up? We're not covering anything up, Mendez said sharply. But we need to manage how this information is released. Wild speculation and sensational reporting help no one. They create panic. They create diplomatic incidents. They create problems that we're not prepared to handle. So what do you want from me? Mendez's expression hardened. We want you to reconsider your account. Perhaps what you saw was flares from a military exercise, or unusual atmospheric conditions creating optical illusions. Your instruments were malfunctioning due to the power failure. You were stressed. Visibility was imperfect. Jorge stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Absolutely not. I know what I saw. My first officer knows what he saw. The passengers know what they saw. The tower controllers know what they saw. Your own military pilots confirmed it. Sit down, Captain, Mendez said, his voice ice. No. Jorge's hands clenched into fists at his sides. I've been a pilot for 25 years. I have 10,000 hours of flight time. I know the difference between atmospheric conditions and a physical craft. I know the difference between instrument malfunction and visual confirmation. That object was real. It was intelligently controlled, and it saved my aircraft and everyone on board. Think about your career, Captain. The third officer spoke now, his tone almost friendly. Think about your reputation. Pilots who make claims like this, well, they tend to find themselves under psychiatric evaluation. They lose their medical certificates. They lose their jobs. The threat was barely veiled. Jorge felt his stomach twist, but he kept his voice steady. Are you threatening me? We're advising you, Mendez corrected. We're pointing out the potential consequences of pursuing this matter publicly. Aerolíneas Argentinas has commercial relationships to protect. The government has international relationships to maintain. You have a family to support. Jorge took a long breath, trying to control his anger. What about the passengers? What about my first officer? What about all the other witnesses? The passengers will be encouraged to view this as an unexplained but ultimately harmless incident. Most people don't want to be labelled as UFO witnesses. They'll accept a mundane explanation if one is offered. Your first officer will follow your lead, and as for the military personnel, Mendez glanced at his colleagues. They understand chain of command. This is wrong, Jorge said quietly. Perhaps. Mendez closed the folder. But this is how these situations are handled, have been handled for decades. Not just in Argentina, Captain. Everywhere. When incidents like this occur, when they cannot be easily explained, they are managed, controlled, contained. Why? Because the alternative is chaos. Imagine what would happen if we officially confirmed that an unknown intelligence with vastly superior technology is operating in our airspace, interfering with commercial aviation. The public fear, the political ramifications, the religious implications, the military uncertainty. Mendez shook his head. No government wants to open that door. Jorge stared at him. So you just pretend it didn't happen? We acknowledge that something unusual occurred. We investigate it quietly. We compile reports that go into classified files, and we move on. That's the protocol. That's been the protocol since the 1940s. And if I refuse to go along with this, Mendez stood slowly, then you'll find your career becomes very difficult, Captain Polanco. Failed medical exams, negative performance reviews, perhaps even an investigation into whether stress or substance abuse might be affecting your judgment. It would be unfortunate, but it would happen. The room fell silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Jorge looked at each of the 3 officers in turn, seeing the same expression on all their faces, bureaucratic determination. They weren't evil men. They were simply cogs in a machine that was designed to suppress information, to maintain the comfortable illusion that humanity was alone and in control. But Jorge thought about the passengers on his flight, families, children, over 100 people who had been in danger and had been saved by something extraordinary. They deserved to know the truth. The world deserved to know the truth. He made his decision. No, he said simply. Mendez's eyes narrowed. Excuse me? I said no. I won't change my statement. I won't lie about what happened. And if you try to bury this, if you try to threaten me or discredit me, I'll go to the media myself. I'll tell them everything, including this conversation. You're making a serious mistake, Captain. Jorge headed toward the door, then paused and looked back. Maybe, but at least I'll be able to live with myself. He walked out half expecting them to stop him, to arrest him, to do something. But they let him go. Perhaps they knew that forcing the issue would only create more attention, more questions. Or perhaps they simply didn't think he'd follow through on his threat. They were wrong. 3 days later, Jorge Polanco appeared on Crónica TV, one of Argentina's major news networks, in a live interview that would be broadcast nationwide. He wore his captain's uniform, his 4 stripes clearly visible, and he told the entire story, holding nothing back. The interviewer, a sharp-eyed journalist named Patricia Valenzuela, listened with barely concealed excitement. Captain Polanco, you're saying that an unidentified flying object deliberately helped you land your aircraft? That's exactly what I'm saying, Jorge confirmed. It provided illumination when our runway lights failed. It positioned itself precisely to guide us in, and the moment we touched down, it departed at a speed that no conventional aircraft could achieve. You realise how this sounds. I realise it sounds impossible, but it happened. I have my first officer as a witness. I have over 100 passengers as witnesses. I have air traffic controllers and military pilots as witnesses. I have radar data. I have video footage. This is not speculation or imagination. This is documented fact. Patricia leaned forward. What do you think it was? I don't know, Jorge admitted. But I know what it wasn't. It wasn't one of ours. It wasn't any human technology I'm aware of. And it demonstrated an intelligence and awareness that was humbling. The Air Force has declined to comment on your claims. Of course they have, because confirming this would raise questions they're not prepared to answer. Jorge looked directly into the camera. But the truth doesn't stop being true just because it's inconvenient. The interview created a sensation. Within hours, it was being replayed on news stations across Argentina. By the next day, international media had picked up the story. CNN, BBC, networks from across Europe and the Americas ran segments on the Bariloche incident, most framing it as a mysterious but potentially explainable event, some treating it as vindication for those who believed in extraterrestrial visitation. As Mendez had predicted, Jorge's life became difficult. Aerolíneas Argentinas placed him on administrative leave pending a psychological evaluation. Anonymous sources leaked stories suggesting he had been under stress, that there were concerns about his judgment. The whisper campaign was subtle, but effective. But Jorge had allies he hadn't expected. His first officer, Marcelo, refused to recant his testimony, even when pressured by the airline. I know what I saw, he told reporters. Captain Polanco is telling the truth. Several passengers came forward publicly to support Jorge's account. They provided their video footage to news stations, grainy but clear enough to show the glowing object pacing the aircraft. They described the fear they had felt when the runway lights went out, and the relief when that mysterious light appeared to guide them home. Most significantly, the Argentine Navy broke ranks. In a carefully worded statement, Navy officials acknowledged that they had tracked an anomalous radar contact during the time frame of the incident. They confirmed that the object demonstrated flight characteristics beyond those of known aircraft, and that it had been observed by multiple trained military personnel. The Navy statement changed everything. It legitimized Jorge's account, made it impossible to dismiss as the ravings of a stressed pilot. The government couldn't easily discredit its own military branch. Still, The official investigation report, when it was finally released months later, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic ambiguity. It acknowledged that something unusual had occurred. It confirmed multiple witness testimonies and radar data, but it stopped short of drawing any definitive conclusions, citing insufficient evidence to determine the nature or origin of the observed object. For Jorge, the aftermath was both validation and frustration. He never flew commercially again. His medical certificate was eventually restored after psychological evaluations found him perfectly sane, but Aerolíneas Argentinas terminated his employment on technical grounds. He became a flight instructor, instead, teaching young pilots the skills they would need to navigate the skies safely. But he also became something else, a voice for truth, a witness willing to stand by what he had experienced even when it cost him dearly. He gave lectures, participated in conferences, shared his story with anyone who would listen. Not to convince people of anything in particular, but simply to testify to what he knew. That on the night of July 31st, 1995, something extraordinary had happened over Bariloche, and the implications of that event were far more important than any personal consequences he might face. Act 5. The Black File. Years passed. Jorge Polanco settled into his new life as a flight instructor and occasional lecturer on aviation safety and unusual flight incidents. The media attention faded as news stories captured public interest. The Bariloche incident became a footnote in UFO history, discussed in specialized books and websites, but largely forgotten by the general public. Then, in 2012, something changed. Jorge received an email from an American researcher named Robert Manning, who specialized in declassified military documents related to unidentified aerial phenomena. Manning had spent decades filing freedom of information requests with governments around the world, slowly building a database of official documents that proved military and intelligence agencies took such incidents far more seriously than they publicly admitted. Captain Polanco, the email began, I've recently obtained documents from the Brazilian Air Force that reference the Bariloche incident. I thought you might be interested in what they reveal. Attached to the email were several PDF files, official Brazilian military documents with numerous sections redacted, but enough visible to paint a disturbing picture. The documents showed that Brazilian air defense radar had tracked the object on the night of Jorge's encounter. They had watched it pace his aircraft, had seen it descend to the runway, had observed its impossible acceleration when it departed. But more significantly, the documents classified the incident using a designation Jorge had never seen before, Category 3I event. The classification was explained in a partially redacted section. Category 3I events are those involving interaction, intelligence, and intervention by unidentified aerial phenomena in human affairs, particularly where the UAP demonstrates apparent awareness of and response to human activity or distress. Jorge sat back from his computer, his mind reeling. The Brazilian military had not only tracked the incident, they had a classification system specifically for events where unknown objects demonstrated intelligent interaction. That meant this wasn't unique. That meant there were other cases, other times when these objects had intervened in human affairs. He called Manning, and they spoke for over 2 hours. The researcher explained that he had found similar classifications in documents from multiple countries. The United States Air Force had something called Cat 3 interventions in documents from the 1960s and 70s. The British Ministry of Defence had active encounter protocols. The French military had Type 4 incidents. It's all coded language, Manning explained, but when you break it down, they're all describing the same thing. Situations where unidentified objects don't just observe, but actively interact with aircraft or ground installations in ways that demonstrate intelligence and sometimes appear helpful. How many cases? Jorge asked. Dozens that I've found documentation for, probably hundreds that remain classified. And that's just since the 1940s. If you look at historical accounts, there are incidents going back centuries that fit the same pattern. Why isn't this common knowledge? Why aren't governments being transparent about this? Manning laughed bitterly. Because transparency would require them to admit they don't know who or what is behind these incidents. It would require them to admit that something far more advanced than human technology has been operating in Earth airspace for decades, possibly centuries. That's not a conversation any government wants to have with its citizens. Jorge thought about his encounter with Colonel Mendez, the threats and pressure to change his story. So they just maintain the cover-up? It's not exactly a cover-up, not in the conspiratorial sense. It's more like institutional denial. Each branch of the military, each government agency collects data on these incidents because they have to. It's their job to monitor airspace and potential threats. But sharing that data, synthesizing it into a coherent picture, admitting publicly what it implies, that's politically impossible. What does it imply? Manning paused before answering. That we're not alone, that we've never been alone, and that whatever intelligence is behind these objects has been watching us, studying us, and occasionally intervening in ways we don't understand for purposes we can't fathom. That's a paradigm shift most societies aren't prepared to handle. After the call ended, Jorge spent hours reading through the documents Manning had sent. Each page reinforced what he had experienced, that these incidents were real, documented, taken seriously by military personnel around the world, but never officially acknowledged in ways that might inform public understanding. He found references to incidents in Chile, where military pilots had encountered objects similar to what he had seen. In Mexico, where commercial flights had reported being paced by glowing discs. In Spain, in Australia, in Japan. The pattern was global and consistent, and in every case where details were available, the objects had demonstrated the same characteristics: impossible speed and maneuverability, apparent awareness of human aircraft, and in a few documented cases seemingly beneficial intervention. Jorge began corresponding with other pilots who had had similar experiences. Many had never spoken publicly, fearing ridicule or career damage. But privately, they confirmed the same patterns. Objects that paced aircraft, objects that responded to pilot actions, objects that sometimes appeared when aircraft were in distress. One retired military pilot from Chile described an incident where his fighter jet had suffered a catastrophic fuel system failure over the Pacific Ocean. He was preparing to eject when an object appeared alongside his aircraft, matching his speed perfectly. In the presence of the object, his fuel system inexplicably restarted. He was able to return to base safely. The incident was logged and investigated, but officially ruled unexplained equipment malfunction, followed by spontaneous recovery. Another commercial pilot from Mexico recounted how her aircraft had encountered severe turbulence that threatened to tear the plane apart. An object appeared above the aircraft, and suddenly the turbulence ceased completely, as if the object were creating a protective bubble. She landed safely, but when she reported the incident, she was told no other aircraft in the area had experienced turbulence, and that perhaps she had been mistaken about its severity. The stories accumulated, each one a piece of a larger puzzle that remained frustratingly incomplete. Jorge compiled them all, creating his own database of incidents that matched the Category 3 the I classification. Intervention events. Times when something unknown had actively helped human aircraft in distress. In 2015, Jorge was invited to speak at Aviation Safety Conference in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He expected a small audience of aviation professionals, perhaps a few journalists. What he found instead was a packed auditorium with representatives from multiple South American air forces in attendance. His presentation focused on the Bariloche incident, but he also shared the research he had compiled on similar events. He showed the declassified documents, quoted from official military reports, and emphasized that these were not fringe theories, but documented facts that deserved serious investigation. After his presentation, he was approached by a Brazilian Air Force colonel, who introduced himself only as Ferreira. "Captain Blanco, could we speak privately?" They found an empty conference room. Colonel Ferreira sat across from Jorge, his expression serious but not unfriendly. I was the officer who authorized the release of those Brazilian documents that Manning obtained. I thought the world should know what we observed that night. Jorge leaned forward. Why release them now after so many years? Because I'm retiring soon, and I'm tired of the silence. Ferreira opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. These are copies of the complete file on the Bariloche, incident from our perspective. Everything we tracked, everything we observed. Some of it was in the documents Manning received, but much was redacted. I want you to have the full picture. Jorge took the folder with reverent care, as if it were a sacred text. Why me? Because you had the courage to speak publicly when it cost you your career. Because you never backed down even when pressured. Because you deserve to know the full truth of what happened that night. Ferreira stood. I can't officially confirm what's in there. If asked, I'll deny this meeting occurred. But unofficially, between two pilots who have both seen things that challenged our understanding of the world, I want you to know what you experienced was real. It was significant. And you were right to refuse to let them bury it. That night, in his hotel room, Jorge read through the complete Brazilian file. It contained radar tracks showing the object's approach, its precise maneuvering, its impossible acceleration. It included communications intercepts showing that Brazilian air defense had been on high alert, unsure if this was an incursion by an unknown aircraft from another nation. But the most significant section was a summary analysis written by a Brazilian aerospace engineer. The analysis attempted to calculate the energy requirements for the maneuvers the object had performed. The conclusions were staggering. The acceleration forces observed would have required energy output equivalent to a small nuclear reactor. No known propulsion system could achieve such performance. The object had demonstrated technology decades, perhaps centuries beyond anything humanity possessed. And yet it had used that incredible technology not to threaten or attack, but to illuminate a runway and guide a passenger plane safely to the ground. Why? That question haunted Jorge more than any other. He had dedicated years to researching these phenomena, compiling cases, speaking with other witnesses. But the fundamental mystery remained. What was the purpose behind these interventions? Some researchers theorized that the objects were extraterrestrial craft, piloted by beings who observed humanity and occasionally helped prevent disasters, perhaps out of scientific interest or ethical obligation. Others suggested they might be advanced human technology from secret military programs, testing capabilities in real-world scenarios. Still others proposed more exotic explanations: time travelers, interdimensional visitors, artificial intelligence systems with inscrutable motivations. Jorge didn't claim to know the answer, but he knew what he believed: that intelligence of some kind was behind these objects, that this intelligence had awareness of human activity and human distress, and that at least sometimes it chose to help rather than harm. In 2020, during the early months of the global pandemic, Jorge gave an interview to a documentary filmmaker exploring aviation, Mysteries. The filmmaker asked him the question that Jorge had been asked hundreds of times. Do you ever wish you hadn't seen it? That you had just had a normal flight that night? Jorge thought about his answer carefully. He thought about the career he had lost, the ridicule he had faced, the years of being labelled as a UFO believer or a pilot who had cracked under pressure. He thought about the toll it had taken on his family, the strain of being in the public eye for something so controversial, but he also thought about the 127 passengers who had been on his flight that night. They had all made it home safely. Families had been reunited, lives had continued, all because something had intervened when their runway lights failed, when disaster threatened. No, he said finally, I don't wish it hadn't happened, because whatever that object was, whatever intelligence controlled it, it saved lives that night. It saved my life. And I think the world needs to know that we're not alone in the universe, and that sometimes when we need help, help comes from the most unexpected places. He paused, looking directly into the camera. I don't know if we'll ever understand who they are or what they want, But I know what I experienced, I know what I saw, and I know that on July 31st, 1995, something extraordinary happened in the sky over Bariloche, something that challenges everything we think we know about our place in the cosmos. The question isn't whether these objects exist. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we continue to hide it, deny it, pretend that the universe begins and ends with human understanding? Or do we accept that there are mysteries beyond our current comprehension, intelligence beyond our current awareness, and that our response to these realities will define what kind of species we become? Jorge Polanco died in 2022 at the age of 74. His obituary mentioned his long career as a pilot and flight instructor, but only briefly referenced the Bariloche incident. To most people, he was just another retired aviator, but to those who knew his story, who had heard his testimony, who had read the documents he had compiled, he was something more, a witness to the extraordinary, a voice for truth, and a reminder that the universe is far stranger and more wonderful than we usually dare to imagine. The black file on the Bariloche incident remains classified in multiple countries. The full truth of what military and intelligence agencies know about these Category 3I events has never been officially revealed. But Jorge's testimony endures, preserved in interviews, documented in books, shared among those who understand that some mysteries demand attention rather than denial. And somewhere in the night sky, over cities and oceans and mountains, the objects continue their silent vigil, watching, waiting, and, occasionally, when circumstances demand it, intervening in ways that defy explanation but demonstrate a truth more profound than any cover-up. That we are not alone, that we have never been alone, and that the universe is filled with intelligence and purpose beyond human understanding. The Bariloche encounter was one moment of contact, one brief intersection between human and unknown. But it was part of a larger pattern, a global phenomenon that continues to this day. And until governments choose transparency over secrecy, until humanity collectively decides to face these truths rather than hide from them, the mystery will endure. But Jorge Polanco's legacy is this. He looked into that mystery with clear eyes and steady courage. He refused to let it be buried, and he insisted until his final days that the truth mattered more than comfort, that evidence mattered more than denial, and that bearing witness to the impossible was a responsibility he would never shirk. On clear nights in the mountain city of Bariloche, people still occasionally report seeing strange lights in the sky, objects that move with impossible grace, that pulse with colours no aircraft ever displays. Most dismiss these sightings, finding mundane explanations or simply choosing not to look too closely. But some remember, some look up and wonder, and some perhaps recognise that the encounter Jorge Polanco experienced was not an ending, but a beginning. The start of a new chapter in human understanding, whether we are ready for it or not. The runway is still there, the same strip where Jorge landed that night under impossible circumstances. Planes take off and land every day, their passengers unaware of the history beneath their wings. But for those who know the story, who understand what happened there, that runway is a monument to a simple truth, that on one night, when human technology failed, something else intervened. Something that should not exist according to our current understanding of the universe, and yet it did exist. It was there. It helped. That is the legacy of the Bariloche encounter, not proof of any particular explanation, but evidence of a profound mystery, evidence that demands investigation, demands attention, demands that we expand our conception of what is possible. Jorge Polanco bore witness to that mystery. He paid the price for his honesty, and he never once regretted telling the truth. His story ends, but the larger story continues. Somewhere in the night sky, the objects are still there, still watching, still waiting, and perhaps when we need them most, still ready to help. The end of Jorge Polanco's account is not the end of the phenomenon he witnessed. It is simply one data point in a much larger pattern, one testimony among many, one piece of evidence in a puzzle that humanity has yet to solve. But it is a piece that matters, a piece that demands to be remembered, a piece that challenges us to look up, to question, to wonder, and ultimately to accept that the universe is far more complex and mysterious than we have dared to imagine. The Bariloche encounter reminds us that there are truths beyond our current comprehension, intelligence beyond our current understanding, and phenomena that defy easy explanation. It reminds us that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply bear witness to what we have experienced, hold fast to the truth even when it costs us dearly, and trust that eventually the evidence will speak for itself. Jorge Polanco did exactly that. He saw the impossible. He testified to the truth, and he left behind a legacy that will endure long after the details of that night fade from memory. Because some truths are too important to hide, some mysteries are too profound to ignore, and some witnesses are too brave to silence. The sky above Bariloche is clear tonight. The stars shine with ancient light, travelling across vast distances to reach our eyes. And somewhere among those stars, or perhaps much closer than we think, something watches, something waits, something that, on one night in 1995, chose to reveal itself and intervene. That is the truth Jorge Polanco gave his career to defend. That is the mystery he spent his life investigating. That is the legacy he left behind. And that is the story that needed to be told.